So, okay, I want to start actually with something very pessimistic that I think that Siniša ended up his presentation. And actually, I understand that whenever we have some traumatic event that becomes a central event for one group, it eventually leads us back to nationalism. So I want to ask here actually what is the role of memory within the human rights regime. Because if nationalism is bad for us, and whenever we try to remember something within this limited group that leads us back to nationalism, so can we get some kind of salvation from human rights? Because human rights is actually investing here money and energy, and we're talking about different NGOs. So let's talk a bit about that. And I want to think here and to propose actually a concept that is not very optimistic. I'm sorry for that. But that actually human rights are giving and adding some more layers to this complexity, post-conflict complexities. And actually what I'm trying to argue here that are not resolving actually nationalism, but are actually strengthening. And I want to show that based on several different points. I cannot get into it very in details because we don't have time, but I just want to stress some of those aspects. First of all, we have to understand that when we talk about human rights and human rights ideology, and I think we can talk about human rights ideology or human rights regime, it has its historical process. And especially if we talk about something that is now anyone who is coming from Bosnia or Serbia from this region, what is known as facing the past, which is kind of meta-narrative of this century, has its own historical roots. And we have to understand those roots so we can understand, and that is my argument, that there is a completely false assumptions about facing the past that will lead us to some kind of democracy, healing, or anything we can kind of take out from this facing the past. First of all, facing the past, the whole agenda, we have to understand it really contextually and historically, but to see that actually it developed mostly in Germany, and there are mainly two different ways to understand it. One is this historian debate, famous historian debate in Germany in the 80s, and then in the 70s, the whole psychologizing of the German nation. Again, the whole psychological concept taken from individual psychology, first from Freud and then transferred to Adler and other psychoanalysts who actually opened up the whole notion that individual psychology can be used for collectives, for societies, and they were actually claiming that without dealing with, coming in terms with the past, one society cannot be healthy, cannot move forward. So actually this transfer from the language transfer and notion transfer from individual psychology to the realm of public discourse and political and social sciences is actually a historical process that has its historical roots, and we have to address that and to try to understand it. How come we ended up now in 21st century with this concept that facing the past is something that will save us? Secondly, second point I want to make here is that we have a gradual process from duty to remember, again, placing it in Germany around 70s, 80s, I can get more into details with that, but we have this duty to remember, which is kind of second generation, post Second World War, and they want to know what happened, and they really want to understand, and they ask questions, and they ask hard questions, and it is completely different, and we'll come back to it. This is not happening here. So they ask questions, and they really want to know how to move from from that position. But got a bit confused. So that duty to remember is something that is kind of moral obligation to a society. But we have a gradual move from that conscience-oriented moral approach into a memorialization policies. And we see, and there is also a historical process that I can explain in length, several concurrent processes happening, especially in the 80s and 90s, such as the birth of transitional justice and the birth of orientation towards the responsibility approach. There has to be a victim, there has to be a responsibility, and we see that pattern taken from Germany but also employed in South America, and we see around that time, 80s and 90s, beginning of the 90s, many conferences sponsored by the biggest NGOs and biggest funds actually starting to make this approach of facing the past as, and with a specific stress to accountability, as something that is a main feature that now we employ in every post-conflict setting. So we have a gradual move from something that is a duty to remember onto something that is a proper way of remembrance. So it is actually a policy-oriented approach that there is, and here I come to the third point, that goes to the conceptualization of human rights and the way the human rights regime actually perceives memory. It goes through three different points, and we talked about a bit about it, about those categories. So we have a category of victim, we have a category of perpetrator, but there is a third category of bystanders, also lessons learned from the Holocaust. So with those three different categories, of course, those who are giving money, of course the Europeans, of course the Western model of understanding and imposing memorialization policies, those are bystanders. We cannot stand still. We have to do something. We have to impose a certain kind of or certain type of memory onto different post-conflict settings. And then we have those two different categories of victims or perpetrators. We spoke about that during this day. No need to say that it doesn't make justice not for the victims, not for perpetrators, because the reality of these categories is always blurred, mixed, gray, and especially those who are actually in those categories never get their needs are never fulfilled and are mostly manipulated. But then with this setting, we have all kinds of side effects when applying this concept of human rights regime and the way human rights regime actually understands memory and implies memorialization processes. And now we'll get maybe, how much? 5 minutes. Okay. Okay, so I will get to some maybe examples here. If you understand it in that way, that you have something that is imposed onto a different cultural context, as we have, for example, Holocaust, I can discuss both Holocaust memorialization policies or Srebrenica resolutions, 3 different resolutions. When you have them implied from outside, you get nothing but the perception from the groups that are being forced to implement them that actually nationalism is a better option. It is a better option because it is being perceived as authentic, as being perceived as oppressed, and that is my also so to say footnote about this Brexit, because you can understand it once that human rights became so powerful, and I go here with Siniša's lecture about organizational power, so you can understand that there is huge power, ideological power also, and organizational power to human rights. Once nationally, and you have also politically correctness together with that, and then you start understand that actually national movements are being oppressed now. That's why they become perceived as authentic. Also, the fact that human rights regime is dividing or understanding conflicts through those simplified, purified categories is actually very dangerous, because that's how you strengthen on the ground actually ethnic animosities along ethnic lines. You have victims along ethnic lines. That's why next generation will understand. We had that question, I think it was for you. How come, what today people should do? Should they care? Should they understand what happened? I mean, there are many different questions and many different answers, but what I'm trying to say that it is a straight outcome of the enforced memorization policies enforced through human rights and through the human rights regime. And then you have a whole new generation that actually, and this is how the logic of the human rights is conceptualizing memory, is transmitted through another generation. Then, and this is my last sentence, we cannot, I mean, we can understand that Jews all over the world, even doesn't matter if they've been ever or have family members who died during the Holocaust, are labeled as victims. And they are not only then, they're just victim nations, and there are many benefits, no doubt about it. There are many benefits, and there is also a huge shift from a hero as we know it to a victim as a new hero. This is also something that we have to keep in mind. And my second example, if you have, for example, third generation Houthi living in Belgium, never been to Rwanda, he's still stigmatized, and he has no way to get rid of this stigma. And this goes again along with this classification that is built in the human rights regime. Thank you.